What is up, Rad Potential YouTube, and welcome to another Build Secrets Radformational video where we're going to talk about rotary engine irons. So, let's get right to it. The whole Build Secrets stuff that we're talking about has mainly been based on this rotary engine criteria for overhaul book. You can get it for free on the internet. I will link it. Download the PDF, make sure all your parts are whatever. I did a video on just the book. So we're kind of going to go through this a little bit, and then we're going to talk about all the other super cool things that are different and the same and interchangeable between all of these irons. So first things first, let's just go over irons in general and make sure that the irons you have can be reused, or you need to replace them, or there's stuff that's wrong. So first things first in the book, distortion. If your irons aren't flat, you shouldn't use them. So what that means is you're going to take a straight edge, not a plastic ruler. I'm talking like a thing that you buy at the Snap-on truck for so much money, and all it is a flat piece of metal, but you know it's flat. You're going to take a straight edge, you're going to lay it across here, kind of a grid pattern like this. The book shows you exactly how to do it here and gives you a spec of distortion. You're going to stick a feeler gauge under it. If the feeler gauge of whatever size fits under there, your irons are warped. Don't use them. You're probably going to have a coolant leak because when you clamp them together, one side of it might be further off the housing than the other. Therefore, coolant seal leak. So, check for distortion. The next page talks about step wear. So, step wear is when the rotor has worn the face of the iron in such a way that it has created grooves on your iron. We're going to use this lovely 12A plate here to kind of show some excessive wear. You can see here all these extra scratch marks in this area. I'm hoping I can get y'all to a spot here where the shine's just right, maybe, so you guys can see it. So you can see all the scratch marks up here, the scratch marks in here, the scratch marks in here. Now those are visibly on there. I can barely feel them. With my finger. So this is not entirely step wear, but this is excessive wear. Step wear is going to look similar to this one. You can see right here, there's one noticeable step right there on the edge. And basically that corner seal is riding through here, and that's what's causing that excessive wear right at that edge. You also can get step wear from the oil control rings. So you can kind of see in this plate here, the discoloration, the marks from the step wear. So that's step wear in a nutshell. That wear applies to every iron. Front, center, rear, both sides of the center. Any of them can have step wear. I would suggest, like I said in the housings video, if you're going to use a set of irons that has some step wear and you can't get them lapped, so getting a set of irons lapped is a way to remove the step wear. If you can't get them lapped, try to pick irons that all have about the same amount of step wear to build your engine. So if the front and rear iron have matching step wear, but the center one's perfect, go ahead. You just don't want to have like a rear iron with a ton of step wear and a front one that's perfect. So consistency is key. Here's your how to check your step wear. You need the same thing you use to check your in-play dial gauge, the stand, and a little feeler gauge as well. So this is kind of another thing, outlining the step wear, general zones of where the step wear, scratches and stuff could be, etc. This right here is something that I kind of understand it, but kind of, sort of, it's a new term. They call it fretting. And basically, what that is shown kind of in the picture to me is like, if you have issues and damage around your coolant seals, so kind of like in this area here that's by the housing, you could get some corrosion in there, corrosion around these as well, but I think they're talking like in this housing area here, where the seals don't scrape it clean, but you might get some excessive pitting or something in there as well. So you can kind of see here, there, images of it there, and then image of the corrosion here. So we'll flip to the next page. Yeah, more corrosion there along the coolant grooves. So one thing that I will say that is very important when you are building an engine is making sure your coolant grooves are clean. So in the housings video, some housings have coolant grooves, some irons have coolant grooves. You'll see here, these grooves are in the iron, and like this plate here, they're not in the iron. This is super easy to clean with a razor blade and get the iron perfect, ready to seal up a new one. This is not, because you got to get in that groove and scrape all that junk out of there. Like, for example, this still has a coolant seal in it. You know, you can see this orange seal. If I can pick it out, I'm not waste too much time, but there's the coolant seal, and you'll get corrosion. You know, just like this has rust in here. You know, same thing, you get rust there. You want to keep these as clean, rust-free, corrosion-free as possible. That covers the book portion of this video. So what we're going to move into next is we're going to start by just going through different aspects of an iron. So we'll say coolant seals, port size, and then interchangeability, because the interchangeability section is going to kind of just be me talking stuff out. But the other things will have a mild organization to them. So we'll start with coolant seals, and then we're going to talk about what irons are like share the same coolant seal style and share the not same coolant seal style. Sure, whatever. So anyways, old school rotary stuff. We're talking 76 Repu truck stuff, GSLSE motors, 12As, stuff like that, and RX8s all have the coolant grooves in the housing, thus leaving the irons smooth. So right here, no coolant grooves. This is a 12A plate. Right here, no coolant grooves. This is also 12A plate, came from that motor. Right here, no coolant grooves. But oh, it's a 6-port, you might say. Is that an FC engine? Doesn't have coolant grooves, means it's a GSLSE engine. Right here, coolant grooves, 4-port. Got to be a turbo or an FD. But then you're going to look again, you're going to be like, oh wait, no engine mount. Got to be a turbo too. So that's what that is. Coolant grooves, make sure they match. You can't build engines with different stuff unless you could have a center iron with one side and the other. Don't do it. Doesn't exist. Don't even think about it. So, to summarize, you can't use an FC engine that has coolant grooves. Actually, no. FC engines, right here, notice, coolant grooves in the center iron, both sides. FD engine, 13B RAW, coolant grooves in the front iron. Boom. You can't use an iron that has coolant grooves in it with a housing that has coolant grooves in it. So which pretty much means you can't build an engine that doesn't have the right mating stuff going on. So know that. GSLSE and before, plus RX8s, coolant grooves in the housings, everything else. So all your FCs, all your FDs, coolant grooves in the irons. One thing to look out for. FCs and FD people, you might have a coolant seal leak. You might think it's actually just a simple coolant seal O-ring failure. However, I have seen these irons crack right here. So this little lip that holds the inner coolant seal in, like right here, where it's real thin, it'll get corroded and this piece of iron will break off, thus having a coolant leak into your combustion chamber. Be aware of that when you buy used irons. You can fix that. I've seen people glue a apex seal spring on there or glue a side seal on there and been like, oh, it's epoxied and it works. I've never done it. I would never do it for a customer. Might I do it for myself 10 years from now if I don't have any other plates that work? Maybe, but in reality, I hate taking engines back apart that I've put together. So if I can limit the probability of doing that, I'm going to do it and just use a new one. So now that we've talked about coolant grooves in science, let's go ahead and talk about ports. So I'm going to start on the center iron and work our way out from there, because the center iron is mostly similar, but not quite. So we're going to talk differences in the center iron and their ports, and then we'll move to the other ones. So I have two center irons here, basically because with these two, I can show you guys everything that you need to know. So this is a tall port 12A. This is a Series 4 13B out of an FC. You can see here, short ports, tall ports. They make 12As that had short ports. They make, like an REW, has tall ports. Turbo 2 stuff has a little bit bigger ports. Keep that in mind. You can see here, tall port, intake port for the primary, short port, intake port for the primary. Baby port, good drivability. Big port, not good drivability. What I mean by that is low end torque comes with a smaller port, not low end torque comes with a bigger port. So, for what it's worth. Now, in general, center irons, things you got to look out for in addition to your coolant seal stuff. A Series 4 FC has the EGR valve on the top of the iron. If you're going to use this in any sort of situation, that you probably will not have this EGR valve unless you're putting together an OEM GTUS. But if you are going to be using this, you need to cap this off. Basically, every single other iron out there does not have an EGR port right here. It's going to be flat like this, and you won't have to deal with it. So, next piece of this puzzle. If you have a rotary that came factory with fuel injection, and no, I'm just going to stick by that. 12A turbo, still carbureted. If you have a rotary that came factory fuel injection, you will have fuel injector holes in your center iron. RX8s, FDs, Turbo 2s, FCs, GSLSEs are all going to have injector ports right here. If you're going to run a carburetor on one of these, you got to cap these off. Now, you can simply, like I did on my rotary truck, put a fuel rail and injectors on here. That seals up your vacuum leak. You don't even have to plumb it or hook them up. Yes, you might ruin the injectors, but you're already running a carburetor. Find some cheap stock injectors to put in there. So, one way to fix it. Racing Beat sells a really trick, like aluminum machined block-off kit thing you can buy, but you know, for the budget ballers out there, just put your injectors in there. So, I think, one last thing. On an RX, I was going to say RX-8, on a RX-7 FC engine, they mount on the center iron. The engine mounts are on the center iron. So, I'm going to flip this over without ideally dropping it all over the place. You're going to see right here, 3 bolts on this side, big bolts. Those don't exist on a 12A plate or an older plate. You're going to see here, casting for 3 bolts for the engine mount. You can use an FC center iron with any other oil pan. They do provide you an oil pan bolt here in the middle, just like they would on a regular, 12A plate or something like that. But note that they have extra provisions on them in the center iron. Does that change anything for performance? No. Also, your coolant drain, in general, is this right here. This dealy whopper drains the coolant out of the engine. It's a little passage goes right here into the bottom of your coolant seal, or coolant grooves. There's the same thing. That little bolt right there on that iron does the same dealy whopper. So, now that we're done talking about center irons, I'm going to put these on the ground over here. And we're going to move on to the oil fill next. You can actually pop these off, put shorter ones there, just press fit. Get after it with a hammer and a channel lock so you'll get that out. So, we're going to go ahead and move on to, let's just go to front irons. Then we'll talk about ports. And then we'll talk about rear irons. Okay, so front irons. People are going to ask if they can run X and X and X water pump on their X and X and X engine. Well, I'm here to tell you that the water pump hole on each one is the same. Now, you're going to see an extra bolt hole on the REW one. Don't worry about it. You could put a 12A water pump on here with shorter studs. It'll cover that up. Just silicone that bolt hole shut. Don't think about it. But the water pumps will fit. Now, not too much of an aside, but a 12A water pump housing requires a 12A water pump. You can put the 12A water pump housing and 12A water pump on an REW engine if it fits with the front cover you're using. So if you're using a first gen front cover, put the water pump for the 12A on there, put an FC water pump on there, doesn't matter. What I mean is the housing goes with the water pump. So if somebody sells you RX-7 FB that's been 13B swapped with some other whatever, and it's got a 12A water pump on it, but they told you the engine was from an FC, and you order an FC water pump, and it doesn't fit in the housing on the 12A, well, then you're going to have to figure out what housing you have. There's a bunch of different ones. They all mount the same. Some are aluminum, some are steel. Sorry, figure it out. Look up pictures. You can do it. I'm not going to make a video on it. Anyways, water pumps all the same. Short story long. Front covers, FD, 13B, 12A, front covers, all the same up to an REW. I don't have an RX-8 front cover or front iron here to compare to, but I would venture a guess it's the same, but I'm hesitant to tell you guys that it is. So verify for yourself if you have an RX-8 engine and you want to put it in a first gen, that a 12A or first gen front cover will work. And by that I mean the front cover that has the bolts on it for an engine mount like this. So front cover's all the same. The thing that is different, the oil pump is different. You're going to see here, FD oil pump, different shape than I think this is a GSLSE, than a GSLSE one. The GSLSE one, I believe, is the same as this 12A one, but the pump itself might be a little bit different. So keep that in mind. Now, oil feeds for your turbos. Turbo 2 and FD are going to have a banjo bolt fitting right here to feed oil to the turbo. There would have been a metal hard line that goes across this to feed that oil. The Turbo 2 ones, I believe, are smaller than the FD ones. Keep that in mind, but you can use, if you're going to put a Turbo 2 engine into your first gen or something like that and not have it be boosted, you will need to plug that hole, otherwise you'll have a geyser of oil coming out. So, now, let's move on to ports. Okay, so I have a good chunk of a good chunk of different ports here to be able to show you guys sizes, placement, everything to the best that I can. Okay, so I'm going to slide this 6-port, this 12A one out of the way, and I'm going to move this Turbo 2 one over here, and we're going to look at port size. Okay, so I'm going to line all these up next to each other, and you're going to get to see the intake port size for all these different engines. And we're kind of going to chat about it a little bit, but you guys can make your own conclusions. So, looking at that, which one is the biggest? If you picked this one, you are correct. This is an REW FD engine. They have huge secondary ports. Like, this port is giant. To put it into perspective, this is a 6-port, and it's almost as tall as the two 6-ports without this, being divided in the middle. So, moving on to that, this is a 6-port. Why is it called a 6-port? If you add up the total amount of ports in the engine, 2 primaries, 2 secondaries on the front iron, 2 secondaries on the rear iron, that's 6 ports. On this iron, this top port has a sleeve in it that spins to turn it on and off. It's controlled by vacuum or electronics, depending on what year of car you have, sometimes a combination of both. So, keep that in mind. These do not have a lot of sauce on them and meat around this to really make these ports huge or do huge bridge ports on these. You kind of got to keep the bridges a little bit narrow. Now, Turbo 2 rear iron, sorry I don't have a Turbo 2 front iron here, and a 12A. Notice, ports are similar in size. A 12A plate is also the same as a 4-port 13B plate. So a 13B that would have came in an RX-5, RX-3, RX-2, whatever, those 13Bs, or a 4-port 13B, they're going to be basically the same as a 12A. The intake pattern on a 4-port 13B and a 12A iron is the same. So if you take 12A irons and you put 13B housings in between them, you have a 4-port 13B. You can use a 4-port 13B manifold on it. Noted. Now, Turbo 2 ports are bigger than these, but not by much. The intake pattern's different, and then the port on this side is also substantial. So, I have 2 mild street port, or we'll say a big street port 12A and a mild street port Turbo 2 here. So you can see the size of that port. It's got a little bridge, nothing crazy. This one has a cracked dowel, which we'll get into here in a second. This is a 12A that's got a full bridge on it, and it is Gunnar. So there's your comparison of an R5 12A plate that's been bridged and a Turbo 2 plate that's not super bridged but has a little bit of a bridge. So don't let the size of this port, the duration of this port, fool you. This port here is not pulled up as much as that one nearly at all. This port would have probably only been this tall. And I can prove that because here's a stock one. So, port size, nothing crazy. As far as my opinion, here I'll waste a quick 35 seconds of your time. My opinion, if you're going to Bridgeport an old school motor, you want to try to find R5 plates. They have a R5 casting number on them here because they have the most meat around the port to make the ports as big and as safe as possible so you don't break the bridge, etc., etc. Now, talking about building engines and stuff, my opinion is build the engine that you have in front of you. Don't go out and try to build something that you can make a ton more power or whatever. If you're building an NA rotary, here's some general horsepower numbers to expect. Okay, NA. If you're going to do a street port, max horsepower, the big carburetor on a street port, or even a dope, awesome fuel injection setup, maybe 180 to 200-ish. Maybe 180 to the wheels, so I'm talking. If you're going to do Bridgeport, depending on the size of the bridge, depending on your intake setup, do whatever. We're going to say NA-wise. Maybe that 200-ish to 230, 240-ish horsepower-wise. Peripheral port, do whatever you want. If you run a big carburetor, Rod Millen made like 300 wheel in an FC that was peripheral ported. So that's kind of the gist of the horsepower ranges. Now, stock port-wise, a stock port FC 6-port engine probably is going to make, it's well sorted with a header and running good, maybe 140 wheel. A stock port 12A with a nice carburetor, maybe 100. It's really just down to making sure you can get air in the engine. So like a Turbo 2 motor that's running NA, 100 and 140, 150, not a ton of power, right? So there's more to be had with compression, and we can talk about that on a different thing. Now, boosted numbers. Can you run boost through any one of these irons? Yes, you can. If you have the intake, fuel, carburetor, whatever you want to set up to do it, run boost through it. You're not going to really tear up anything, I would say, unless you're trying to make 700 wheel on a stock 4-port 13B, from back in the day. You're fighting high compression, 3mm apex seals, a whole bunch of different stuff, but you probably wouldn't. So, boosted applications, the FD engine is going to slay because it has giant ports from the factory. You can take a stock Mazda block, 4 or 550 horsepower on a big single turbo all day long, and you won't stress this motor out. Now, same thing, we're going to move over here. I guess not, now, a 6-port block like this, if you want to run boost through it, which I did in my FC, you're going to want to pull these sleeves out, run a turbo manifold. You could boost through the NA manifold if you really wanted to, but there's a lot of valves and stuff going on in an NA manifold that just kind of get in the way or break or could fall apart, so I'd want to just get rid of it. On an FC, the 6-port pattern is the same as the Turbo 2 pattern, so you can run a Turbo 2 lower intake manifold on a 6-port engine. You'll just have to port match the Turbo 2 ports. As you can see here, this port shorter, whatever, this port a little taller, but it is the same intake bolt pattern here and here. What was I getting into? Okay, boost, power. If you're making a lot of power, the rear iron is something that you will probably break if you're abusive to a rotary engine and you have succumbed to the poly engine mounts and all this other stuff, and you're a drifty boy clutch kicking things. So, on your rear iron, if you can imagine this engine being all bolted together and you're trying to twist the engine apart, most people would think that the horsepower created within the engine is what breaks it, but it's actually the fact that when an engine is trying to drive a car, it's exerting a rotational force upon the back of the engine that the engine mounts have to counteract in order for the engine and transmission to not spin like a cyclone underneath your car, right? If you have broken engine mounts, your engine tries to fall over, okay? So, if you fix the engine and fix the transmission so they can't rotate, you shouldn't have any issues at the interface between them, right? If you clutch kick it, the trans is fixed, the engine's fixed, the whole thing doesn't turn, you're not going to break stuff. However, if you're running, we'll say you did an engine swap, right? You got an engine, you put it in. Somebody told you, oh, get poly engine mounts because your stock ones are probably broken and you can do whatever down the road. Okay. If you now fix the engine harder than you have fixed the transmission, you're creating a point in that system where the transmission can move, but the engine is staying more solid, right? So you're going to tweak the trans and the engine's going to want to stay fixed. That is how you will break rear irons. So the short story long, on rear irons and the porting stuff that we talked about with the fronts, the same on the rear. On rear irons, the dowel area has varying sizes. So, for example, a 6-port dowel area back here you can see is super thin, right? Lots of room for this to get destroyed. Lots of room for this to get destroyed. A little bit more toughness, big, sturdiness here to not get destroyed. But your tension bolts is not what keeps that engine from rotating. It's actually the dowels. The dowels do all the work. The tension bolts are sitting in a big, hot dog down a hallway kind of situation. So when you clutch dump one of these, you will break this top dowel because the transmission's grabbed onto here and it'll break that, as this one's cracked. An FD engine, Series 5 late model 6 or Series 5 Turbo 2 late model. If you go look at the Turbo 2 engine I built for Nick and his white FC, we got a big dowel rear iron. That's something you need to know if you're going to try to do power, or don't be too abusive on it and make sure your engine mounts match. So engine and trans mounts, run stock engine mounts with a stock trans mount, run poly engine mounts with poly trans mount, run solid engine mounts with a solid trans mount. You don't want them to move independently. So now, an aside, back to the differences in the irons. You will see variations in casting around this vicinity, i.e. this 12A does not have an oil pressure sensor right here, but this 13B Turbo 2 does. This GSLSE 6-port plate has an oil pressure sensor. That one does not. You will see variations just in the 12A stuff really, but this is the line that would connect to your heater core. A beehive car will have a T fitting on this to hook into the beehive. You can just cut it off behind the T if you're going to use it in some other application instead of capping it. You will also see a variation up here. So FC engines, fuel injected engines, the newer ones are going to have a coolant port on the top of them. This is going to go up to the thermo wax on the intake manifold to help basically heat up the intake quicker for emissions and stuff. Same thing here. If you need to, you can pull these out. They are just a press fit fitting, and you can drill that and tap it for a pipe thread fitting and either put like an AN line on it, or you can just plug it with like a brass plug or something. There are some variations too. You can just see here this FC one, their inspection plate cover has a hook on it, so there's no need for an extra bolt hole over here, whereas the early 12A ones and early motors, some of them tend to have an extra bolt hole here where the inspection plate is bolted on with 2 holes. On the back of the iron, I wouldn't necessarily say this is stuff to be concerned about, but you can see some variations just in the thickness of the casting, and I could, if there was a weight thing I could show you, but you can see here, T2 FC, a lot less meat around the back of this iron here. The tension bolt holes are protruding more, whereas on this 12A one, you just see how solid that is. Tension bolt holes are flush. Nothing wild and super crazy. The freeze plugs are still in the same place. I imagine this was just to save some coin on how much cast iron they're putting into these things. You can look here, GSLSE, about the same casting as that 12A plate. So, while we're here, there's different oil pedestal heights and stuff too. So, if you're running like an FD one or whatever, you can get a low mount one or a tall one from an early 12A or whatever. Run a beehive if you want. So, I think in that 30 minutes that I've covered just about all of the common questions you guys would have about irons. Any of the newer Rotaries, FD and RX-8, are going to have engine mounts that are different from the earlier ones, but I don't think that their provisions will get in the way of you putting that engine in, say, a first gen or an FC or whatever. Obviously, if you have an FC and you want to swap an REW in there, you're going to need an engine mount bracket because of the iron, being funky. I've never seen an engine built for an FC because technically, I guess you could build an REW with an RX-7 FC center iron, and then you could just mount it in there and have REW outer plates and an FC center plate. That would work. But that's about it. So I'm going to leave you guys there. Thank you guys very much for watching. Make sure if you have questions, comment below because I can answer them. Notice the channel is not ginormous. I generally can reply to every question. I apologize if I don't. And no, I generally don't sell stuff. So if you ask me if I have stuff for sale, I'm just not going to reply. But comment below with any awesome questions about this stuff, and I'll do my best to answer them or give you my recommendations or whatever. Also, thank you guys very much for subscribing. For those of you that do, helping to grow the channel is always a great thing, and I appreciate every one of you guys that have been along for this ride. So stoked for the new year. I appreciate the feedback on the Holly Sniper question. I'm probably going to get to ordering one of those right at the beginning of the year. That'll get my GSLC running, and hopefully I can show you guys how all that stuff works. And I do apologize for this thing taking forever because, well, you can't just fully restore and repaint a car when you're one dude on a YouTube schedule making 3 videos or 2 videos a week. So I appreciate you guys watching these informational videos and that you guys want to learn about this stuff. You know, this channel isn't so much about crazy fun and entertainment as we are about making sure that you guys know what you're getting yourselves into and can learn about these cars. You know, there's not a lot of people that understand these cars. Most people think they're witchcraft and wizardry, especially these engines, and I want to prove to you guys that it's easy. You know, these aren't really hard. I'd rather put like 4 of these together than a small block Chevy, and I've done both. So, thank you guys very much for watching and listening to me ramble. Keep it rad. We'll see you next time.